Good morning, distinguished guest presenters and panelists and everyone. And I would like to welcome you to this session 3.2 of the Asian Clean Energy Forum 2020. And today we're going to be talking about planning, designing, and building for climate resilience. And let me introduce myself. My name is Oli Noroyono. I'm Director for Energy Division in the Pacific Department of the Asian Development Bank. And we have with me actually as a backup moderator, Stephen Peters. He's a senior energy specialist with the bank as well. So I hope you enjoy your opening sessions and first day sessions yesterday. And I hope that you will also enjoy today's sessions and the rest of today and until the forum ends. And for those who attended the sessions yesterday, there was a polling that was posted in yesterday's session. And there was a question that posted. The question was, what is the most important energy sector consideration during recovery from the pandemic? That's the question that was posted by the organizers. And 45% of the audience voted for enhancing energy sector resilience to future cities, to future crises, be it from the market, climate, and pandemics. So this shows how important this session is for power utilities, for governments to make sure that the energy sector is resilient to external and future shock. Okay, so we'll have some interesting presenters and panelists today, and I would like to invite two of my colleagues from the Asian Development Bank to set the scene for today's discussions. And first is Mr. Samuel Tumiwa, is the advisor for fragile and conflict-affected, in the bank. And the second is Argo, he's a senior climate change specialist with the bank. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to invite Sam for setting the scene for all of us, and then later on I will introduce the presenters and also the panelists in due time. But before you start, Sam, let me just say a few words on the logistics or protocol. So if you have questions, please write your questions in the chat box, which I will read out to the relevant speakers and panelists during the discussions. And identify your name and to whom your questions are addressed. I may have to combine or summarize your questions depending on the time availability, and I apologize for that. And so that's the protocol that we have. Okay, so Sam, over to you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, Paoli. I'm Samuel Tumiwa. I'm the advisor for fragile and conflict-affected situations at the Asian Development Bank. I serve as the corporate focal for FCAS. However, I started my career as a renewable energy specialist in ADB almost 20 years ago. I think I'm the only person to have had that title in ADB, so I'm really pleased to be part of the Asia Clean Energy Forum. And using a term coined in jest a few years ago, but it's actually true, this is the best event of its kind in the world. I also want to thank the organizer of having a track on FCAS and SIDS as a very important issue, but of course I'm biased. In the last half century, Asia and the Pacific has achieved unprecedented development. Millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. Most of the countries in the region are now considered middle income. However, we are still faced with many challenges. Most important is inequality. We need to address pockets of underdevelopment and poverty and make sure no one is left behind. To address this, ADB Strategy 2030 calls for differentiated approaches for FCAS, SIDS, small island developing states, low and lower middle income countries, and upper middle income countries. So what do we mean by this? It means that we need to work differently in various situations. No more cookie cutter approaches. We need to be very context specific in our work and to ensure our work is relevant in the countries that we're working in. Which brings us to fragility. What do we mean by fragility? I think a good way to explain this is as follows. A government is expected to be able to provide for its citizens through policies and regulations, development of infrastructure, delivery of basic services, and so on and so forth. It needs to have the financial, institutional, and technical wherewithal to do this. This ability is often challenged by economic fluctuations, natural hazards such as typhoons and earthquakes, and as we're facing now, COVID-19. It's challenged by internal and external conflicts and spillovers from regional instability. Now, the government's ability to manage these challenges is a measure of its stability and resilience. So the countries that ADB categorizes as FCAS, we really need to pay special attention and provide additional assistance to help them manage these challenges. Now, ADB's objective in working in FCAS and SIDS is to help them to progress from fragility through the development continuum and transition towards greater stability and resilience. So how do we do this? Fundamentally, it's about governance and institutional capacity. So for ADB, we really need to move upstream in our work. So often the focus of our discussions and our work is really at the investment and project scale. This focus needs to move upstream. We really need to focus a lot more on policy issues, regulatory dialogue that we're having and that we're engaged in, especially in the energy sector. We, and by we, I mean the broader we, as in the government, development partners, civil society, private sector, we need to ensure that the policies and regulations encourage sustainability of the sector, encourage efficiency, and attract private investment. After policy and regulatory dialogue, the second most important thing, I think, is capacity. Ensuring that the governments have the capacity to plan, undertake, and enforce. If they don't, additional assistance must be provided to build this capacity. Only after that should we really be talking about investments and projects. And just to close the loop on these investments buy us a seat at the table, ADB, to see that on policy and regulatory dialogue. And in fact, the size of the investment dictates influence on the policy and regulatory dialogue. So investments are equally important. But then at the project level now, we need to also ensure that the way we provide, the way we design projects are context sensitive to where we're working. And the way we design our implementation and monitoring is also context sensitive. Previous to this, I was the country director in Afghanistan. And we would go, and we couldn't get to all the project sites. And in trying to address this at the back end after the project has been designed and under implementation, it's very difficult. So we really need to move forward in the design of our project. Similarly, in small island states, we need to consider the capacity of the government to manage the ability of the contractors and even equipment available to undertake construction. So as we continue discussions on this track, I hope you will keep things in mind. Thank you very much, Pauli.
Thank you, Sam, for setting the scene. So let me now invite Argo Sinha Roy, our senior climate change specialist with the bank, to give his views on this today's discussion. Argo, please, over to you.
Thank you, Oli, and good morning, everybody. So moving from FCAS in SIDS to climate resilience in SIDS, and as Oli said, that most of the participants yesterday has highlighted the importance of resilience in the energy sector. Now, the question is, how do we support governments in ensuring the energy sector, the entire system, is resilient to shocks and stresses from climate change, so that the negative impacts are reduced? At the same time, how do they increase their capacity to anticipate, absorb, adapt to, and also recover from shocks where needed? So there are five key issues we thought would be interesting for us to cover in this session. And moving on to the next slide, the first issue is really strengthening climate resilience in small island developing countries a choice, or it's actually an imperative? We think it's the latter because firstly, because of the location, the size and remoteness of these island countries, it increases their exposure and vulnerability to various kinds of hazards, such as tropical cyclones, floods, etc. But secondly, because of changing climate variables like increase in temperature or change in precipitation patterns, will actually impact the outputs, efficiency, and reliability of energy sector, such as hydropower, wind, or solar. So it's no longer a question of choice, but how do we go ahead and actually make the sector resilient? The next slide, an often common discussion when we talk about resilience is how do we ensure resilience building is cost effective and does it yield dividends? Largely, the literature suggests a resilience building is cost efficient, of course, depending on a project location, the scale, the complexity. But recent estimates conducted by the World Bank says that the net benefit of investing in more resilient infrastructure in low and middle income countries is $4 benefits for every $1 of investment. And this net benefit actually doubles in a climate change context. So it's even better to invest in resilient infrastructure. The third slide, however, building resilience, there is no specific blueprint or silver bullets. And this is because of two issues. One is climate risk is constantly changing, it's dynamic. And as a result, the management also requires to be an iterative process. On this other side, energy sector is also part of a large, complex, interdependent sector. More and more, the boundaries between energy, mobility, water, digitization, all is becoming blurred. As a result, when we build resilience, we need to understand that this is part of a larger system. So what is perhaps required to build resilience is to have an end state vision of where we want to achieve, develop a set of pathways on how it can be achieved, and recognize that we are looking at only one part of a larger system, so the interconnectedness should be established. The next slide, however, energy sector systems, each system has to have certain qualities. And qualities include robustness, flexibility, and other qualities which are aligned with the principles of G20's quality infrastructure investments. As explained in slide 5, we are talking about, for example, in terms of robustness, an energy sector investment has to be designed, constructed, and maintained and to keep in hazard considerations and point of view. Or in terms of flexibility, it has to introduce decentralization and modular approaches so the systems are more flexible. Thus, these qualities may not be available in all projects, but we should try and ensure that certain qualities are introduced depending on the context. And the last slide, or the last concern is no one single solution is possible to build resilience. We need a package of solutions. Of course, on one side is hard infrastructure to make this infrastructure and energy sector itself resilient, but equally important to look at social institutional solutions, ecological or ecosystem-based solutions to make the sector more resilient, and of course, financial solutions to ensure the sector is financially prepared to deal with risk, both to reduce the risk, but also to manage the residual risk. It is only with such comprehensive approach we can move from resilience of energy sector to a more resilient energy sector. Thank you. Over to you, Ollie.
Thank you, Argo, for setting the scene. So I think, dear audience, so we have two speakers setting the scene for all of us. And now we are coming to the three presentations, which will be, done by three distinguished speakers. So one is Nicole Baker, and then second is Divina Chingwanko, and the third one is Harald van Hoeken. Let us start with the first one, and I will, briefly summarize her profile. Nicole Baker is a principal of Nicole Baker Consulting, based in Australia. She has almost 2 decades experience in strategy, institutional development, and program design in climate change, renewable energy, transport, and biodiversity across the Asia and the Pacific region. So Nicole has worked with the Marshall Islands government for over 17 years. So most recently as a team leader for the Marshall Island Electricity Roadmap in 2018. So she's gonna be talking about improving coordination for strategic energy investment in SIDS and FCAS, case study of Republic of the Marshall Islands Electricity Roadmap. So over to you, Nicole. Thank you.
Thanks, Ollie, for that great introduction. Okay, thanks, Ollie. So thanks for the introduction. I just want to acknowledge also that this project was carried out with the very generous support from the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. What I'd like to do today is share some of the things that we learned from this process that colleagues and I think could help with sector planning in other SIDS and potentially also in fragile and conflict-affected states. So first of all, I want to start by situating us in the Marshall Islands. So there's a photograph of the main island of Majuro. There's a population of around 55,000 in the Marshall Islands, and you can immediately notice a few things looking at this photo. The land area is very tiny. The elevation across the country is less than 2 meters above sea level. So it's extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And I think we'll hear a little more about that from one of the following speakers. You can also see from this photo some obvious challenges around renewable energy. There's no hydro, no geothermal, no biomass to speak of. So none of the things that could provide dispatchable power. Solar and wind are really the main resources, but as you can also see, there's a lack of space to build these. These islands can only survive and thrive if there is very high ambition from all countries to reduce emissions. Marshallese have shown great leadership on the world stage by setting ambitious climate change targets, developing decarbonisation strategies, and encouraging other countries to do the same. So what are the reasons for the Marshalls to do a long-term electricity roadmap? I think it's really obvious that to achieve ambitious climate change targets and to build climate resilient systems, there's a need to map out the pathways to get there, which is why long-term low emission strategies are, of course, a feature of the Paris Agreement. There are a couple of other reasons which I think are more pertinent to SIDS. So when we initiated this project, we started to look at the energy sector in the Marshalls. We saw a lot of what we might call development partner congestion. There was kind of a traffic jam. There were large amounts of funding, multiple projects, the World Bank, ADB, EU, JICA, New Zealand, Taiwan, and all these projects were actually being designed quite independently from each other. And that's partly a result of the increased attention being given to, obviously, to energy in the last few years. Now, as a small island developing state, you naturally have fewer people to absorb to deal with this level of activity. Each project came in with a different donor team, a different consultant team, and people in the Marshall Islands were all being expected to field multiple missions most weeks and providing the same information over and over to try and manage this multitude of projects. So one of the points I'd really like to make today is the high transaction costs imposed by a lack of donor coordination really has a big impact on these small countries. So if we think about what the benefits of a long-term strategy might be, the first is that we are taking the time to really get alignment between stakeholders. And once you do that, once you get on the same page for where the country is going and everybody really understands the pathways, the choices and the trade-offs you have to get there, then future decisions become much easier. You have a common ground to stand on. One of the important things the long-term thinking allows us to do is to unlock transformational thinking. When we look at the whole system over a longer period of time, it really allows us to cut through that incremental thinking of what's the next project and what's the next project. And what that means when you do that thinking, the long-term thinking, is that early investment decisions often look quite different if you don't do that thinking. And look, I think it's really important here that this is a country-driven investment coordination framework. So it really needs to articulate the ambition of the country. There's a long-term vision, and then there's a series of short-term investments that the country and development partners can then work together more effectively on. Oh, I'm missing a photo there, but the scope, just a little bit about what the roadmap covered. We looked at 3 time horizons, 5, 10, and 30 years, out to 2050 and net zero emissions. And we looked at 4 general themes. One was the technology pathways. What do you actually have to build to get there? The second was workforce and education. How are you going to have the people to manage the system? The third was around policies and institutional arrangements. And the fourth was financing. How are you going to pay for it? I just want to touch on a few key aspects of the process that made it successful. I think sometimes these processes are seen as a little bit of a technical process or a tick the box. The consultant team comes in and says, here's your master plan. They do some consultation. The way we approached this one was really to see it primarily as a process of dialogue and deliberation by Marshall Islands leaders that was supported by expert advice. Another part that was really important was we had really active coordination engagement mechanisms. So inside the country, we worked with the cabinet and the president, ministers, the chief secretary, and senior staff across the sector. And in order to support that, we provided someone full-time in country to be the secretariat for that and to provide the structure and the container to enable those to be really high quality conversations. We also had really active engagement with development partners for the duration of the project. So we met on a teleconference about every month to 6 weeks and often had in-between conversations. These were substantive conversations on the content of the roadmap and also information sharing, relationship building. The partners also peer reviewed all of the technical work, so they would have confidence in the analysis and advice being integrated into the roadmap. And then finally, on the consulting team, we were multidisciplinary. We all had experience in the Marshall Islands and the region. We knew the environment, we knew the people, understood the context really well. And I think this was really critical in helping us to work through fit for purpose solutions. On the technical system design, so this is the real nitty-gritty of the investment planning. Again, we took the long-term whole system and we did a backcasting approach. And what we found is if you take that end goal, which is net zero by 2050, and you have a couple of milestone targets in between, you immediately start looking at what do you need to build for a very high penetration variable renewables island system. And that gives us quite different early investments to what if we were doing it incrementally. And one example is there was one large project planned for solar panels supported by batteries. And when we did the design work, we saw that we could just about double the amount of renewable generation into the system and also lay foundations for a much more resilient and robust renewable energy system in the future if we changed what we were doing with that money. So the real benefit, and that was to buy new high-speed diesel generators, which sounds anti-intuitive, but that's actually what you need to get to the high renewables faster. So the real benefit here is there are efficiencies and effectiveness that come from long-term whole system thinking. Another thing that we really focused on, and I like to hear Sam mention this just then, is the appropriateness of the technology. There were lots of proposals for things that actually weren't appropriate. So we reviewed all technologies and against some criteria, including were they commercially available, was there access to support, was there local capacity to operate and maintain, and so on. And one sort of, again, anti-intuitive result was for Madro and eBuy, it's much better for them to have large, centrally controlled utility scale solar and wind rather than distributed household solar systems. So really a couple of messages here is to do the long-term holistic thinking, take a backcasting approach, and really make sure your technologies are context appropriate. A couple of thoughts on financing and the way development partners are currently working may be a barrier to effective implementation of long-term strategies. So there was a strong preference when we did this by partners to fund separate projects and not to pool funding. And as we've seen, we found it would be much better if we could design and implement the system more holistically. Thank you. Some partners had a preference to fund only renewable energy generation technology. Others were doing the full gamut to budget support. But there was, in fact, a gap around the kind of keeping the lights on equipment and also the things that would make the renewable energy system work, such as integrated control systems. Finally, there's a push for private sector involvement in energy in SIDS, but in fact, funders have a preference for funding to be spent on CapEx. So the financing mechanisms encourage spending on CapEx. So if you're going to have private sector involvement and independent power producers, that capital expense becomes an operating expense for the utility and the government. So again, a key message here is that development partners really need to think about financing mechanisms and what they're willing to fund in order to enable this more strategic investment in the energy sector. So just wrapping up, long-term sector strategies, they do take effort. They take new ways of working together, new ways of thinking and talking, and they take persistence and commitment from all parties involved. The money they can save in improved effectiveness and efficiency of investments would easily pay for these processes, and they're relatively inexpensive compared to the amount of money we're talking about. And finally, I really believe that if they're done well, they can be transformative. In terms of better investments that get us closer to resilient and zero emission systems, but also in increasing the institutional capacity to be strategic and respond to climate risk and other challenges. And this is actually an opportunity both for the country capability and I think also for development partner capability. That's it from me. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nicole. Excellent presentation from you, highlighting the importance of long-term planning in Marshall Islands, especially. Let me now invite the second presenter, Divina Chinquanco. She's a senior energy policy specialist with the US-based RTI International. So Divina brings 38 years of experience in the energy sector, serving in both technical advisory and project management positions across different countries in Asia and Africa. So her in-depth familiarity working in high-risk environments and exposure to a diverse culture enrich her role as chief of party of USB leaders in leading USAID efforts to support the rapid restoration of electric power service in transitionary shelters in Marawi city of the Philippines. So she's gonna be talking about keeping the lights on, keep the hopes high. Divina, over to you. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for joining me as I take you a trip down memory lane and share with you what USAID did and how USAID responded to the crisis in Marawi. I'm Divina Chinquanco, working with RTI International with headquarters in North Carolina. We have 12 offices across the United States, including one in Washington, D.C., where our energy team works. We also have 13 international offices. As you can see from my slide, RTI's expertise expands so many sectors: education, health, agriculture, water, most fitting to the ACE of 2020 team. And our energy team has been beefed up with a blend of very seasoned veterans like me and young, hopeful professionals with wide expertise too. In 2017, Marawi City was violently seized by extremists who pledged allegiance to ISIS. After 5 months, Marawi City was a city of ruins, leaving 1,000 people dead and 300,000 internally displaced persons or IDBs. Our job was to provide or augment lighting facilities in Marawi City, keeping the lights on, what the military said, in order to discourage ragtag elements of the ICs from regrouping and recruiting young people and taking advantage of the abject misery following the ruins of Marawi. So we were charged in 10 months to provide lighting facilities to 3 transitory shelters. Sagunsongan, which is a decent shelter with detached units. Sarimanok, which is the traditional tented sites. And a third city funded by the Office of Financial Disaster Assistance, or OFTA, and implemented by Catholic Relief Services. One of the challenges that we face trying to put up 205 units of solar powered units is the lack of infrastructure. This is not strange to me. I've seen so many people, but it hasn't stopped me from admiring the brawn and determination of people trying to physically put together these streetlights. We not only provided street lighting, but we also crossed over and touched base with our health partners in order to provide lighting for 4 rural health clinics using solar power. At the end of the project, USAID funded 205 units, benefiting 8,000 IDBs, and 22,000 patients annually benefited from the 4 solar roofed health units. This slide basically provides a summary of what USAID did in Marawi. Aside from lighting up the IDP shelters, we helped Record recover its database. We employed or engaged the right engineers to provide strengthened power system resilience in Marawi, complemented that with the resilience compliance plan in accordance with a DOE circular. And aside from touching base with our health partners, we crossed over to our education team and basically trained out-of-school youth to do repair and maintenance of solar-powered streetlights and solar power panels. There are so many lessons learned, but I only picked 3 in the interest of time. There was chaos in Marawi, but there was order in the chaotic corner that we had, because we work with great government agencies. At the helm was the Department of Energy, who provided all the support and coordinated with Task Force Bangon Marawi on our behalf. We also were supported by the Mindanao Development Authority, who was then led by the late Secretary Alonto, and a highly respected official of the Islamic community. But there was one local champion for me, a GM lady, GM Leklek Duko from Lasreco. Without her, we wouldn't have done anything in Marawi. One of the issues on solar street lights was sustainability. The batteries run dry and then they won't work anymore. So what we did was to include 5 years warranty in our request for proposal, hoping that in 5 years, Lasreco will be back in its feet and being able to embed that budget, the repair and maintenance of the solar street lights. One thing that really was a sad happening in the project was the death of a crew. You know, the saying, don't count your chickens until they are hatched. We were happy that we were on track until disaster struck. Our crew was ambushed by armed men, and unfortunately, one young father of 24 died. And, you know, RTI's policy was never to provide insurance for temporary workers. But RTI correctly assessed how critical the situation is. So we basically covered our health workers for the period that they were engaged under us. It was primarily for health, but it has a life policy rider. And at the end of painful months of running after police investigators or insurance adjusters, a young widow enjoyed $4,000 US. Cheap to us, right? But it was so much for her to be able to build a small house and build a small sari-sari store. I'd like to end my presentation with interviews from people, how technology touched their lives. The first one was from Sarimanok, and she was telling me that they were so surprised and they were so happy that our crew came, installed the streetlights. But at the same time, they became so sad because last record people were not around to put up the wires. And suddenly when dusk came, one bulb lit up, another bulb, and then the entire place was lit up. Basically, they jumped, they were happy. It was like Christmas to us Christians and Eid to them. The gentleman echoed the same thing, like it's like Luneta Park. And if you were in Manila, Luneta Park is not like Disney, but it is where people go to on Sundays, bring their children, and it's like an airport. But the last lady on this slide gave me the inspiration for this presentation. She told me that the highlight of their day was trying to wait for the bulbs to light up. And when the lights are on, it gives them a sense of hope. Thank you for joining me and sharing how Marawi changed my life. I remember going home and thinking on my way back to Cagayan de Oro, 3 hours away. And I said to myself, here I am. I complain a lot about so many things going wrong in my life. And here they are. They're just so happy that they have lighting at night. Thank you.
Thank you, Divina. This is a great story you share with us. Now, let me go to the third presenter, Harald van Hoeken. He's a Chief Operation Officer of the US-based Ocean Life Foundation. So Harald has 25 years of experience in West Africa in oil and gas investment, oil field exploration and production services, and mining. During the course of 2019, Harald developed the idea for the Ocean Life Foundation with Haver and McDowell in order to provide funding to ocean-based renewable energy technologies for protecting coral reefs and their complex marine ecosystems using low-volt electric fields. So he's gonna be talking today about growing low-cost engineered barrier reefs for coastal protection and beach restoration and erosion control. So over to you, Harald, please.
Yeah, thank you, Ollie. It's a pleasure to be presenting here again. My first presentation at ACEF was last year in Manila, where I had the pleasure to present Oceans of Energy's offshore floating solar technology. And this year I'm back as Ocean Life Foundation. And my presentation in Manila last year was actually the catalyst for setting up the foundation, which I co-founded with my partners, Chris Haver and Michael McDowell. And today I'll be talking about one of the many applications that offshore floating solar could produce. The Ocean Life Foundation is a non-profit hybrid organization. We're focused on technology incubation. We're looking to invest in projects and technologies that will have climate change impact. We'll provide grants for research projects and early stage development, as well as debt equity capital for entrepreneurs and startup companies that have moonshot ideas. Our emphasis is on the ocean economy, with a specific focus on coral reef protection and restoration, mariculture, and coastal defense. We use the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to select our projects. And we have a key emphasis on climate change. We're looking to develop carbon negative and carbon neutral solutions technologies, as well as fostering economic growth in the most disadvantaged and most at-risk nations. Key points of my presentation today is climate change is threatening coasts globally, mainly through sea level rising, but also because of coral reefs are dying. Current global methods for coastal defense is using a combination of sand, rock, and concrete. And not only are these very expensive, they also have a very high carbon footprint. And if we want to have a carbon neutral or carbon negative society by, let's say 2050, we shall also have to address, the carbon footprints of coastal defenses. And the engineered living reef, working with nature, is such a possibility. It's not only a lot cheaper to do, it's also got a very low carbon footprint, and it also has a significant positive impact on restoring biodiversity. 40% of the global population lives within a narrow band of about 100 kilometers of a coast. And sand beaches are buffers that protect these coastlines, with about a quarter eroding. And over the next 30 years, about 14% are predicted to be completely destroyed. And by the end of this century, almost half of beaches around the world are at risk of disappearing. And of course, low-lying islands like most of the Pacific Islands, Marshall Islands, Maldives are of course at greatest risk. Of course, developing nations need funding and technology to combat this. Coral reefs are natural breakwaters, and they dissipate 97% of wave energy. And what this allows to do is that the sand that's in the water can settle behind and build beaches. Coral reefs are dying rapidly because of climate change, coral bleaching events. 50% have died already, and another 90% of coral reefs are predicted to die by 2050. So not only do we have the loss of an entire ecosystem, we also get the loss of their coastal protection. And as you can see, a dead reef with no life on it will have very little ability to dissipate any wave energy once it crumbles and disappears. So the predominant methods are using rock, sand, and concrete blocks, and they're all based on diesel-powered energy, so which has a very high carbon footprint. They're also expensive. They need frequent repairs, as well as these barriers are designed to deflect and reflect energy back into water, which basically causes erosion elsewhere downstream or upstream from these barriers. Mineral accretion technology is a system that's been used for over 40 years, which is basically the deposition of limestone on steel bars using low-volt electricity. Corals secrete calcium carbonate, and in the presence of a mineral accretion electrical field, they grow about 4 to 5 times faster. And the concept of the engineered living breakwater is to take this and do it on a large scale. So the engineered living breakwater is basically a combination of mineral accretion technology and using the concept of large prefabricated rebar cages, which they use in the construction industry. And here you see an example of a 10-meter high prefab rebar cage. This just happens to be a picture of the base of a pillar used for a road bridge. So these rebar cages can be pretty much built to any size and shape that is required. Once they're put in the water, they will get an electrical current through them, and limestone will settle. And with the limestone growing on it, the structure will have similar properties as standard steel reinforced concrete used in construction. These systems, these barriers, they will basically mimic natural coral reefs and dissipate wave energy. This will allow sandy beaches to grow faster than sea levels are rising. The benefit also is that it will attract marine life. They will live in and around these living breakwaters. And as an example for this structure here that we've had a preliminary design for one of our projects in Madagascar next year, 3 meters high, where about 2 meters is below the sea level, the low water sea level, and 1 meter above, we can build about $1 million a kilometer, fully installed and operational. And with using solar panels, it has a very low carbon footprint, and being built locally to the area where it's going to be deployed provides local employment opportunities and boosts local economies. If we can take a specific case study of Majuro in the Marshall Islands, we can see there's severe erosion in both in the coastal lagoon side and the Pacific side. Concrete rubble and seawalls are losing the battle, lack of funding to continue maintenance. You can see here that you get these big indentations of erosion. With about $1 million a kilometer, requiring about 125 kilowatts of power, for the engineered living breakwater. We could conceptually build one here at the reef edge, which would allow sand to settle behind and restore and protect the coastal area on a longer term basis. In addition, giant clams, which are a high value export product of the Marshall Islands, they could be grown behind or in and around these engineered living breakwaters. They would grow about 4 to 5 times faster in the presence of electricity, which gives an extra boost to GDP. Runit Island in the Marshall Islands is an area where there's a big radioactive dump left by the United States during the Cold War, about 140,000 tons of radioactive soil. And it's covered by a dome, and with rising sea level, this is at risk of sliding off. Conceptually, a 5-kilometer barrier reef could be built here and grown over time at a relatively low cost. This is not going to be a permanent solution, but it might buy society 30, 40, 50 years of time before a more permanent solution is left to this environmental looming disaster. The engineered living reef is not only for areas where corals grow, it's possible to do it anywhere in the world. In more temperate areas where you don't have corals growing, you could use oyster reefs or mussels or any other mollusk that is native to the environment. Or you could even just have the rebar cage underwater with electricity and let limestone grow in it, and nature find its own way of what marine habitat wants to grow on there. So in short, climate resilience is important. The engineered living breakwater will help grow beaches faster than sea levels are rising. And it's got the lowest cost and lowest carbon footprint for coastal defense. And as an important benefit, it will create a habitat for a thriving marine ecosystem. The Ocean Life Foundation is planning to its first project in Madagascar next year in combination with several partners, as well as funding further research project in collaboration with American universities for further research of mineral accretion technology benefits with the University of Hawaii. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harold, for introducing this technology to all of us. And it seems that Marshall Islands is a popular country in the sessions. The first speakers also talk about Marshall Island, and Harold also talking about Marshall Island. We're coming to the discussion session now. So we have 2 panelists to start with the discussions. Noel O'Brien and Bishal Tapa. So let me now invite Noel to speak first. Noel is the principal climate change specialist with the Asian Development Bank. So Noel, so over to you.
Thank you, Ollie, and thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to join the panel this morning. It's been really interesting to hear Nicole's work with the Marshall Islands government on the long-term planning in the electricity sector. This is an area where ADB colleagues are involved with investments. We're currently supporting the reconstruction of the diesel tank farm, which is obviously part of the whole process of sustaining power on the islands. But also, as Nicole has indicated, that the low emissions diesel generators are such an important part of the transition, but also that resilience in the system going forward. Harold's work on this engineering system, the protection of the coasts is just such an important area. This is the second time I've had the opportunity to see him speak. And I know it's an area that we really want to, strengthen our collaboration with as we go forward with the solutions for the Pacific countries. I have a couple of slides that I wanted to just draw attention to and focus in. As Ollie has mentioned, our focus is obviously the Pacific Department, the SIDS, and I just want to remind you all of where we are when we talk about this. So many of these countries are amongst the most vulnerable countries in the world. Vanuatu, Niue, Tonga, all Micronesia, all so vulnerable to, first of all, sea level rise, which is accelerating with the melting of the ice caps and how the Pacific is responding to that sea level rise, but also the increasing strength of storms, which are such frequent challenges for these Pacific islands. I wanted to just, look at as an example of Tonga, which has most recently been impacted by Tropical Cyclone Harold in April, but also since 2014, we have had 4 major storms. So the costs of these storms for the economies are tremendous, and the effort that is put into recovery is such a huge drain on resources. We look at these illustrations of part of the main island of Tongatapu just on April 9th. We can see the sheer force of the destruction when you have a storm that coincides with a king tide and a massive storm surge. So these really are immediate challenges for us. And then I want to just also take note of just the sheer destruction that's taken place in Vanuatu with Tropical Cyclone Harold in April. I mean, our condolences to Vanuatu colleagues who lost, where lives were lost, but also just the efforts to try to reconstruct the country where we have the double challenges of COVID, the limited movement, and etc. That's causing additional challenges at this stage. So that brings me to the question of what does ADB do? What are the steps that we're taking for building climate resilience in the energy sector? For all of our investments, ADB makes sure that those investments are climate proofed for future climate change. Here are just 2 examples where we're currently planning for an investment in the Alawa Dam in Samoa. This is a multi-purpose dam which will contribute to flooding in the city of Apia, but also to dealing with drought by water storage, and then also electricity generation. We have made the best efforts with climate scientists to ensure that the dam design will be appropriate for the future extreme rainfall that's likely to fall in the Apia, in the catchment of the Vasigana River. Likewise, just also a slide from the Marshall Islands here. This is the diesel farm tank. It was constructed, I think, in the early 70s, about 40 years ago, and now it needs to be reconstructed. There is a perimeter wall, and so again, the question of how do we ensure that this is protected from future sea level rise, extreme storm events, are all part of the process that we go through with our project preparations. Davina talked about the building back. I mean, her example in the Philippines relates to obviously a conflict context. For most of our situations across the Pacific SIDS, it is building back after these extreme events. And here is an example of some images from Tonga, where building back after Cyclone Gita is focusing on installing underground cables where it is appropriate, putting in place stronger poles, focusing on the cables, but also building the capacity of the staff so that they are working to international standards. Orgo at the beginning set the scene, and we talked about this whole system level resilience. This is an area where ADB is scaling up its work in the Pacific. Our project, which is the Greater Port Villa Urban Development Strategy, which is in the preparatory stage, is being developed based on this multi-hazard analysis, which has been conducted for Port Villa. And we're also now starting to work on a multi-hazard analysis for the main island of Tonga Tapu. And this is all to identify resilient pathways for the city. And obviously this is a multi-system approach, not just focused on the energy sector, but we do note the importance of ensuring that energy is part of that process. The other area where we're starting to do more scaled up work is on the comprehensive energy sector resilience planning or disaster risk reduction investments. And some of these points are taking from some work that's currently moving forward in the Federated States of Micronesia, where we have where Micronesia is developing a disaster risk reduction action framework for the energy sector. It was brought up in Orgo's session yesterday, this whole question of how are we applying GIS-based mapping to the power systems, and how are we overlaying that with a broader GIS-based hazard planning for the islands and the urban centers. You know, how are we considering equipment purchases and a managing of equipment so that we have backup for these disaster events? How are we, as Sam set out in the beginning, this whole institutional arrangements and the policies and the capacity. So how is the energy sector coordinating with other disaster management agencies and making sure that the assets and the utility of staff are all in place? So those are just some of the thoughts about the 4 processes where we're involved: that climate proofing, the building back better, the broad holistic approach to planning, and then just focusing in on energy sector resilient planning. In terms of financing these types of investments, obviously under strategy 2030, ADB has made its commitment to climate change with the $80 billion commitment. Within the bank, we have the Asian Development Fund supported by our development partners. One of the examples of funding specific within the Pacific countries is ADB's contingent disaster financing, which was designed for climate-related and geophysical hazard events, but which is now also being used to support 8 of the countries to respond to the COVID emergency. And a new round of funding is being prepared. ADB works in partnership with other co-financers. So, for example, with the GCF, we're involved with the GEF, but also many of the bilateral donors across the Pacific. So those are just some of the thoughts from me, and I'll wrap up there. Ollie, thank you.
Thank you, Noel, for giving your thought about planning. Let me now go to the second panelist, which is Vishal Thapa. So he's a managing director for Saral Urja, Nepal. It's a distributed energy services company in Nepal, and he's also an independent consultant. He has worked extensively across the energy sector on power plants, energy market, energy efficiency, distributed energy policy, and sector reforms. So over to you, Vishal. So thank you.
Thank you, Oli. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. It's great to be here, as always, in ASIF. As Oli briefly mentioned, I am with Saral Urja, Nepal. We are a young distributed energy services company. We use solar storage and energy management to provide our customers with energy services. Because we use long-term contracts that directly with customers on a customer-to-customer basis, we're able to help them avoid the investments that we make. But we are, more than just a company. We've been able to raise some investments, 2 rounds of investments we have closed with Business Oxygen, which is a fund supported by IFC. But I think we see ourselves also as change makers in the country. To succeed in this environment in Nepal, we realize we have to push boundaries on financial markets, on energy systems, on technologies, etc., and we see ourselves with that. So every day I sort of wake up thinking, there's a 50-50% chance we'll thrive and succeed, or we'll fail. And the failure, if it comes, will not be simply because the potential or the opportunities didn't exist. It's simply the weight of the inefficiencies, the environment, and the other components that remain as challenges simply overburdened us, and we weren't able to come across that. So, I'm the only speaker in this session that doesn't have a presentation, which is great because I've been able to soak in everything, and I think I can reflect on some of that. All the presentations really resonated with me, and I think in the context of Nepal, obviously it is in dire need of resilience. It's an extremely vulnerable country in many dimensions. First of all, we are post-conflict. So I very much appreciated the story that Divina shared. We went through a long, brutal conflict, 20,000 people dead, many, many displaced. We are still wiping the blood off of that conflict. Justice for victims are still in the works. We are also an extremely climate vulnerable locality. We have large number of glacier lakes. We are a very vulnerable Himalayan region. We are also very vulnerable in the energy sector. We are extremely dependent on one source of generation, which is hydro, and it compounds because the climate challenge then makes hydro generation in the longer term a bit more unreliable. In agriculture, we are entirely almost dependent on rain feed, so we're not able to use irrigation to manage this. We're also dependent on a single transmission line from India that supplies almost 60 to 70% of our generation. So when that line goes down, you can be sure what happens. We're going to be plunged into darkness. And increasingly, we find ourselves in the hotspot of a big geopolitical region. There's increasing conflict between India and China. The US is extremely now influential in that region. And so as a small country, trying to manage these multiple complexities is very, very challenging. And so do we need resilience? Absolutely. Do we need all the types of resilience that has been demonstrated by the previous speakers? Absolutely. Do we need the resources to be able to fund that resilience? Absolutely. But, because I come from the private sector, and I guess that's where I've been working with largely, maybe I can share the perspective, and that begins to challenge some of the points that were made earlier, or at least supplement some of the points that were made earlier. So my fundamental question isn't that we need resilience. The answer is absolutely we need resilience. But the question is, how do we get there? What are the sources that enable us to do it? And I very much liked Nicole's statement about how we need longer term holistic thinking, and the example she drew from that to demonstrate why it was a success in that particular project. So clearly we need long term. But how does that one deliver it in Nepal? If we look at, in Nepal's context, the political economy is now very, very well suited for this kind of diversity. So we have a federal system in which a new constitution, it's quite an amazing, I think, forward-looking constitution. It offers a very new kind of federalism that is extremely decentralized, and that actually pushes power down to small communities and municipalities. We have 753 municipalities. And I often joke that actually, if from a timing point of view, Nepal is the smartest country because it really decentralized at a time when distributed energy and distributed technologies was really making it possible. So all of a sudden, our political economy is now there to be able to do it. The government had also at one point several years ago, maybe about 2 years ago, created this vision of having a distributed energy system in every municipality, and then it was interconnected to the grid, and we thought, wow, it's all super. But every time I think through this, and I think, wow, that creates a lot of opportunities, a lot of this sense of change. I'm also struck by one of the tweets that I had once seen by Faith Burrell, and I want to bring this up here because this tweet has really haunted me, and I think I want to prefix my whole sort of talk around this and some of the ideas that we've had before. Faith Burrell, the executive director of IEA, and he tweeted this in 2018, November 13, 2018, and I quote, and this was around the time as they were releasing the World Economic Outlook for 2018. Our World Economic Outlook 2018 analysis shows that over 70% of the global energy systems will be government-driven. And as such, the message is clear. The world's energy destiny lies with government decisions. And I thought, wow, well, if you happen to be in a country that has a government that fails you, it's tough for you. And this is where we are in Nepal. The question is, can governments really deliver on the type of resilience we're talking about? Or do we need alternative mechanisms as well to be able to supplement? And so this is the first question I have, is who actually delivers this resilience? As an energy services company, we work with a large number of distributed customers, but we find that our biggest bottlenecks are actually in government policies, it's in government subsidies, it's in the corruption that is extremely endemic and that sustains vested interest. So it's not like the solutions are not known. The solutions are known, but we just can't seem to overcome these challenges. So my first question to, I think, development partners that work very, very extensively in Nepal, and Nepal is one of the most aided countries in the world, is the challenge that you have to walk the talk. The investments in resilience cannot be an excuse for sustaining the status quo. You have to invest in alternative systems outside of government channels. You have to invest in local communities, and you have to find the ability to create a network of change makers that are also pushing government towards long-term holistic thinking. In our view, a lot of the development assistance and the foreign investments that come into Nepal, which mostly come from a development perspective, are crowding out many companies like us. They make it extremely difficult for us to mobilize. They make it extremely difficult for us to pursue change, and they make it extremely difficult for us to be critical of our own governments. And this is what I feel that we also need to be able to look at, is how we actually deliver this kind of a network that is able to pursue these investments in a way. So the centralized mechanism of delivering resilience, we feel must be collated into a network that begins to challenge the monopoly of the state in these areas. So a classic example, I want to, again, relate back to an example in Nepal. Several of the speakers have talked about the need for diversity in this system. Sam's early presentation and Arga's early presentation also talked about the need for diversity. And while Nepal does have a vision of sort of interconnecting all of these systems, from a energy vision point of view, it's also a government that is increasingly growing its monopoly over the energy sector. So it's talking about a vision that is called, Nepal's waters, people's rivers, in which the government will basically invest in all the hydro plants, and it's very centralized hydro plants and distributed through these centralized grid systems. So how do we as citizens, as private sectors, as change makers, how do we begin to contest that if these investments are being financed by development partners and foreign investors without asking the question about whether community members have really participated in this process of building this vision? And this is what I feel that we need to be more and more critical. Yeah. So as I said, Nepal is a very fragile state from many, many dimensions, but this is also a very, very exciting time. We have a great constitution that is extremely decentralized. And my appeal to development partners, to the international community and well-wishers of Nepal is to really ask whether the centrality of government is really enabling us to meet the aspirations we have in terms of resilience, in terms of our own political goals, in terms of our own empowerment, and to urge everybody to look at a broader network of change makers outside of governments as sources for investments and mobilization. And we think that makes us far more resilient than simply a reliance on government systems. Thank you. Over to you, Oli.
Thank you, Vishal. Excellent observation and a lot of questions to be answered by development partners like the ADB. Okay, so now we have 20 minutes left before the end of this session. So I'm not going back to the presenters at the moment. Let me read out some of the questions, and I will then reach presenters and panelists based on the question that I receive. So I'll combine some of the questions because they are related. So the first question, I think, this is not addressed to a specific presenter or panelist, but let me read this. On the planning side, we all agree that building a renewable power plant is the right thing to do. However, we have not touched on what plan do we have for the existing non-renewable power plant once renewable has taken over the role of purchasing electricity. So anyone would like to respond to this? Maybe Nicole would like to start with, based on your planning exercise in Marshall Island. What do you do with the existing diesel, which in Marshall Island, I understand, in 98% electricity is generated by the diesel right now. So I'll go to the presenters or panelists. Maybe Nicole can start.
Thanks, Oli. I can speak about that in the very specific context of the Marshall Islands. So when we did the whole system design out to very high levels of variable renewables and even to 100%, the least cost pathway for the Marshall Islands with what we can see from now is actually to have diesel generators right to the very end. And if you have the right kind of diesel generators, so what actually happened was the ones that they had previously, old, slow generators, weren't the right kind. But new high-speed diesel generators would actually allow a lot more variable renewables into the grid because they adjust to meet the variability of that power. And then in the longer term, once you get past 80% renewables, the least cost pathway that we could see from today's technology was really to use biofuels, green biofuels. So the pathways that we were able to map out, that equipment wasn't ever going to be redundant. I hope that will change, and I hope that we're not restricted to using biofuels, and in 20 years' time there are, or 10 years' time, there are a range of other technologies to get us to 100% with storage. So that was the experience of the Marshall Islands.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. Anyone else who want to chip in on this on these questions?
Yes, Ollie, if I may. I think if we look at the trend of renewable energy costs, specifically land-based solar, the rapid decline, and we can expect the cost to keep coming down and down, and as well as battery technology investments, having significant investments, we can see a step change in the next decade. I feel that these diesel generators are going to become obsolete a lot quicker than we think. Just because the solar battery combination is going to outcompete with any diesel generated power much sooner than we think. And at that point, the only thing that's left is to decommission and recycle the tank farms and the diesel generators. Over you to Ollie.
Okay, thank you. This one question that may be relevant to Divina. How to build resilience, especially people who manage the infrastructure when a shock is happening, taking into account level of education, culture in the area of the infrastructure, as power plant mostly located in village level area.
Yeah, based on our experience, like it's a combination of so many things, policies, incentives, and I'd like to echo Noel's point that resilience actually should include community capacity building. So it's really working with local government units, and as you said, some people are not that educated, but I'd like to believe that effective communication campaigns that are well targeted can really like put together a system wherein everybody contributes and making them understand there's just no other way to build back better but to work together.
Okay, thank you, Divina. Harald, do you want to add on this subject?
I'm sorry, I'm at a loss for an opinion at the moment.
Okay, we have a couple of questions for you now. Let me read for you. This is very specific to your topic. A couple of questions I'll combine into single one. Is the introduction of large amount of rivers still not creating a pollution issue for the sea reef, for the sea and for the reef? And the second question, I must have missed how the electricity is generated for the engineered reefs technology. Okay, let me stop these two questions. I combine into one. Over to you, Harold.
Sure. Those are two very good questions. And the first answer to the first question is the steel rebar going to be pollution? No, the answer is that the steel rebar within a matter of days is going to be completely encased in limestone, and it becomes a permanent structure. And actually, it's going to be enabling corals and all sorts of marine life to thrive on there. We have 40 years of evidence of empirical data that how this works. In itself, steel is not a pollutant. It's an inert material. It will oxidize, which we call rust, and it will disappear. The electric field will actually coat it in limestone, and that allows it to survive on a permanent basis. The electricity required that can be generated in many ways. You can have solar panels on land. So in the examples on the Marshall Islands pilot project, you would have solar panels on land with a cable out. We're using a very low voltage system, 6 volts. Whether you transmit DC to or AC from onshore to offshore with a power converter, that's just an engineering issue, and that's why we call it the engineered living reef. It's not rocket science, but there are some trivial things that we need to manage properly. If you're further afield, like we're going to be in Madagascar, we're about 5-6 kilometers from the coastline, and it's still very shallow. we will most likely use Oceans of Energy's offshore floating solar technology, which they've developed not specifically for this purpose, but which is a completely storm-proof floating solar system that you can deploy basically in any water depth and any distance from the coastline. So rather than having a very long cable from the coast, we will have energy generated right there at the reef. Over to you, Ollie.
Okay, one more, if I may. How long does it take for the material to create or to create and become effective coastal barrier?
It's a very good question, Ollie, and that is really the research of our pilot project or pilot projects we're going to do to measure and model that. But we believe that from the 40 years of empirical evidence using coral restoration projects, we believe that within 12 months, the reef will be populated with marine life, and there will be sufficient limestone growth. You get about 2 to 4 centimeters of radial growth of limestone on these rebars. There will be sufficient limestone to start dissipating a significant portion of the wave energy. But we believe that for it to become a proper coastal barrier that acts like a reef, we believe somewhere between 2 to 3, potentially as long as 5 years. Depending on also some engineering factors, whether you apply higher voltages, higher currents to speed the growth, the deposition of limestone, but there's a risk that becomes too brittle. So this is the kind of research that the Ocean Life Foundation will be funding. Over to you, Ollie.
Yeah, thank you. There's one question for Noel or ADB colleagues. Climate vulnerable states are increasingly discussing the need to move beyond basic climate proofing of infrastructure to more transformational adaptation and disaster risk reduction efforts, which are likely to require more funding. Now the question is, how can MDBs respond to and support this push for more transformational adaptation and resilience building? Noel?
Yeah, thank you, Ollie, and a great question. I mean, we in the Pacific Department in ADB are currently developing our Pacific approach, which is our strategy for the SIDS for 2021 to 2025. And within that, this is exactly the consideration that we're working on. How do we move beyond climate proofing? How do we support the countries to take a more holistic approach to climate resilience, to address these sea level rise questions and these extreme events, and to look at how we set out a pathway. And that's a pathway across all sectors. In some of the countries, we will have to work to address some of these very, very challenging questions. In terms of financing, ADB brings technical assistance finance to the Pacific. That is currently supporting holistic planning level with the government of Tonga. We're very happy to say we've just kicked off the work on a multi-hazard analysis. This is to look at how we work with the government of Tonga on the island of Tongatapu and the capital city, Nuku'alofa, to address the major challenges that the city poses with the combination of tsunami risk and sea level rise, as well as the extreme events. We are also in discussions with the Green Climate Fund, GCF, as to how we can cooperate with co-financing. When we talk about setting out an adaptation pathway for ADB, that's not an expectation that ADB will finance all of those investments. the expectation is that ADB, there would be a prioritization of those investments. It would be moving forward as quickly as possible with the no regret options, making sure we choose the long-term investments to reduce risk, and that's risk to the greatest number of the population and assets. It's also to make sure that we avoid lock-in, that where we have rural populations moving into the urban centers, that we try to ensure that people are not moving into high-risk areas. So we're not investing in systems such as transport, water, and energy in areas where there will be future greater risk. Obviously, we see this as an approach that requires the collaboration of all the investment partners and the creating investment environments that are more appropriate for private sector. I've noted also Bishal's comment on the whole question of community involvement and obviously for ADB, stakeholder participation is a very important part of all of the project and investment planning. But also maybe it would be a good point for Orgo to also maybe make note of some of the work that he's doing on the community resilience partnership, which I think is very much ADB recognizing the whole significance that community resilience brings to the total resilience of these communities. Ollie, I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Noel. I think similar question also addressed to the two scene setters, but I think you respond to the same question. But I just want to invite Argo. Do you have anything to add from what Noel has just said?
Thanks, Ollie. Just to very quickly, as Bishal said, yes, at the end of the day, resilience building requires a whole of society approach where government will play a critical role, but government is not the only stakeholder to play a role. And every one of us have a role to play. And in this context, community involvement, I think it's just not about involvement of communities. It's a very passive way of looking at it. It's beyond that, and how can you make communities the center of decision-making process so they are the agents of change in building resilience. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Argo. There's one question for Nicole. This is very specific on the question. The question is, how was using diesel generator more resilient than use of batteries while integrating with solar power? I'm not sure if this is, yeah, Nicole, did you get the questions?
Thanks, Ollie. So I really prefer questions about strategic dialogue and how you get people to talk to each other about these big issues. So I'm not an energy engineer, but I'll convey what we found. So in the early stages, it's cheaper, even with the decreased battery prices, to use fast diesel generators. That's just a simple cost-benefit analysis of the different options. As you get up into very high levels of renewables, so what we found is the cheapest LCOE was, the lowest LCOE was around 60% of renewables in this island system. There's a couple of peculiarities around island systems which don't apply to bigger grid systems, and that is they're islands. They can't bring in power from somewhere else, and they can't get rid of power when they have too much. So when the sun's shining and the wind's blowing, there's nowhere to dump the power. I mean, you just have to not use it. And when those things aren't working, you have to get that power from somewhere. So batteries are a part of the solution from what we've studied. Now, even when batteries get really cheap and fuel gets really expensive, the size of the batteries for somewhere like Majuro becomes a major issue. So we mapped out how much space a battery big enough to manage the grid would look like after 80%, and it would take up it would take up the whole port, basically. You'd have to build it on the whole port. You would have to raise it 12 feet above sea level to protect the batteries from storms. So this was looking at the whole, all of those constraints. And the price was, I think, something like 3 times higher at that very high level of renewables than it is if you're using biodiesel or something at the end. Now, biodiesel isn't an indigenous resource for the Marshalls, and there's a lot of not very good biodiesel around. So we hope something better will come up. But that's the problem with batteries at that very, very high end of renewables on an island system.
Thank you. We reached 12 o'clock now, but let me run 2 more questions which are very interesting. This is for Divina. Is solar energy the only way to go for Marawi city? Is this sufficient? That's question for you. And how is it different from the earlier USAID projects in terms of sustainability approach? This audience refers to Amore USAID project. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with this. Divina?
Yeah, at the time, the use of solar power was what we would call a quick response to Marawi, meaning it's so easy to install, no need for data like hydro, but definitely there are a lot of small river systems in Marawi that they can tap and do hybrid systems like solar, battery, hydro. But it takes a lot to put up a hydropower plant, meaning you have to have 2 years worth of data on, whether it's feasible or not. But I think Marawi is going that direction. It's now part of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, meaning they have their own budget now, and they're going to do their respective energy plan. And part of that is developing their hydro.
Okay, thank you. Let me go now to the last question. I think this should be responded by ADB colleagues responding to or raised by Vishal. On how do we make sure that we are not crowding out the private sector who has the capacity to invest in renewables? We keep receiving this kind of questions from time to time. But any of ADB colleagues in this session would be willing to respond to these questions? No one?
Ollie, I mean, I can come in a little bit, but it's not on the forefront of my mind. I think some of the other energy colleagues, but I mean, ADB is actively involved in promoting private sector investment in the renewable energy sector in the Pacific. Our colleagues in the private sector division are involved. I think if we take the example from Tonga, where we have been involved at the sovereign level, but I'm very aware that that has paved the way for private sector investors to come in and to take over and move the investment forward. Also maybe to make reference to a new initiative where ADB for the first time, certainly in the Pacific, is considering making funding available through the banking sector, so that private citizens are able to purchase solar equipment for their housing, which can be interlinked with the grid. And that is, again, from my perspective, I feel that we're encouraging private sector in that level. Again, maybe this is, I'm going to hand over to Orgo here, where the whole promotion of community engagement from managing decision making on the types of investments that should be made to support resilience in their communities, to overseeing the financial investments around those decisions are all areas that the bank is involved with now. So I leave it there, Ollie. Thank you.
Thank you, Noel. Vishal, do you want to?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I ask it all the time. So I may not necessarily have all the answers, but I can certainly share my perspective. And our general experience is that the crowding out does occur. It's very significant, and it really hurts companies like us and others who want to get into this. There's a number of things that I think we can do. One is, first, all development partners and governments, I think, have to be clear on what the overall policy approach is. If government decides, look, it wants to do everything, development partners want to fund it, that's fine. Like, we can step out and do other things. There's 20 other million things to do. So I think first is to be clear. Second is to be, I think, more precise, at least in the context of Nepal and other countries where I've seen this, is to be more precise on what exactly we mean by public-private partnership. The term is bantered around, but it's very loosely defined. And so, any sort of, when a government awards a contract to a private sector company to build something and walk away from that project, to me, doesn't constitute a public-private partnership. But I think fundamentally, once you get beyond all of that, development partners have to look at how to directly fund and invest in enterprises, not projects. So the idea is to move away from a project-centric approach. In Nepal, if you look, all projects are successful, but the enterprises are never successful. And so how do we move away from a project enterprise, from a project level engagement to an enterprise level engagement? I think going through banking channels is one, but the biggest constraints I see from at least development partners and investment perspectives is that each company or enterprises in Nepal are small, and so the transactional costs may be very high. But I think there are ways to get around it. You can build aggregators, you can build different sort of umbrella organizations that fund many of these. You can create funds. The ones that we got investment from, called Business Oxygen, is kind of an example of that, backed by IFC. I think fundamentally, it's a lot more difficult to invest in private enterprises and non-governmental organizations. And I think we just have to be believed. Like, we also want to be a party and stakeholder in this growth and resilience. And we are encouraging development partners, government, to look at the belief that we have, the capacity that we have to be able to do it, and to overcome some of the challenges in sort of getting there. We know we're not at scale, we want to get there. So how do we build those kinds of instruments that allow us to overcome those hurdles?
Thank you, Vishal. This is a great topic, and probably we need one more session to talk about this. But just want to mention to the audience that we are in the Pacific trying to promote private sector deals, and we have a few ways or approaches how to do that. As you know, the Pacific islands are very small. The size, the project size is also very small, so it's not always easy to attract private, and we have developed ways to do that. I think we've come to the end, and I apologize that apologies for exceeding the time, but it was a great discussions, great questions, and great response. I also apologize not able to read all of the questions, but I believe and I hope that I cover most of them. It's a great one. So on this note, I would like to thank scene setters, the presenters, and also the panelists, and of course the audience. It's kind of strange feeling. We have reported 4,000 people attending this forum, but no one is sitting next to me. But anyway, so once again, I would like to thank everyone. I would like to thank Stephen for backing me up, and of course the technician teams which makes this event successful. So thank you everyone once again, and hope that you will enjoy the rest of the day, and hope that we'll be able to attend all the sessions in this forum. Thank you, and I don't know. Usually we clap, no? We can't clap now. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, and then have a good day.